Hey everybody, just thought I would do another quick screencast to explain an element of Macbeth that may have some of you shaking your heads, scratching your heads, wondering what's going on. And that is the way in which Scottish kings were, or the way in which they succeeded to the throne. Because if you've been reading the play, there's a few things that might have made you sort of go, what? Um, One is, Macbeth he's an earl, but he's not part of the royal family, right? He's a relative of Duncan's. Macbeth says that I'm his kinsman, and that's a reason why I shouldn't be murdering him. But when the witches give Macbeth the prophecy that you'll be king, he should have said, well, I can't be king. I'm not part of the royal family. I'm not in line for the throne. The second thing that might have made you scratch your head is when Duncan names Malcolm, his eldest son, the Prince of Cumberland, which means he's saying he'll be the next king. It's kind of a, well, duh, like, of course your eldest son is going to be the king. Like, why do you have to, name him? And then secondly, why does he seem so surprised and annoyed by that, right? He's thinking, well, I'm going to have to get around that. In other words, our understanding of the way kings get to the throne is based on a system that wasn't operating in Scotland at the time of the play, and this system that was operating explains why Macbeth would even think he had a chance and why the witch's prophecy even makes any sense, right? In our world, in our understanding of succession, the eldest male child always succeeds the reigning monarch when the monarch dies. So Elizabeth II, who's the current Queen of England, when she dies, her son Charles will succeed. Charles being the father of William and Harry, right? And then when Charles dies, William will be the king. So Harry will never be the king unless William dies, right? His older brother. Because after William will be George, his son with Kate Middleton, right? So it goes from father to eldest son to eldest son to eldest son. Brothers, cousins, nephews, adopted people twice removed. They're even though they're part of the family, they're never in line for the throne unless somebody dies. Well, that's not true in Scotland. And it explains some of the things in the play that may make you go, you know what I mean? Shake your head. So I want to explain the two systems briefly. They are, quickly, um, Primogeniture is the first one, and it was practiced by the English, and the second one is Tanistry, practiced by the Scottish, okay, and other Celtic European peoples, but we'll get to that. So primogeniture comes from the Latin, and the best translation is simply firstborn. So primo being primary or first, geniture generated or born. First, primary generated, firstborn. That's primogeniture. This is what the English practiced, and the system that we're probably used to, if we're aware of any system at all, it's this one. So the reason primogeniture was practiced in England was primarily because of William the Conqueror, and William brought it from Europe, which is Europe in which it was the dominant system prior to William conquering England in 1066, and it had certain benefits or pros. The primary one was there was never any question about who would be the next king. And that may not seem like a big pro, but it actually was a big pro because it ensured that everybody knew where things were going. And so it preempted a lot of civil strife and unrest and uncertainty and that kind of thing, right? But you could plan ahead because you knew who the next king was going to be. But like any system of human devising, it had its cons, and there were two main ones. The first one was it all worked great if you had a good king who had a son who was just like him. If you didn't, either you had a bad king who had bad kids, or you had a good king who happened to get a bad apple as the eldest son. There was no means in primogeniture of preventing that inept, unqualified, incompetent son from becoming the king. The only thing you could do is figure out some way to murder him, and which is exactly what happened with Edward II. Edward I was a very good king from an English perspective, anyway. Not so much if you were Scottish, uh, but he had a son who was just not king material. He wasn't interested. He cared about poetry and riding horses, and he had a penchant for young male friends. And he just infuriated everybody. And eventually, his own mother and her lover, after his father died, when he had become king, his mother took a lover, and the two of them basically got rid of Edward II. So that was the only way you could deal with it. The other problem with primogeniture is it only works if you have sons. If you don't have any sons, then all the bets are off. You could have daughters, but then there's no guarantee that anybody would recognize the legitimacy of a woman sitting on the throne. And there are times in history where this was an issue. Henry I, who died in 1035, he only had a daughter, Matilda. And before he died, he made the English barons swear that they would support Matilda as the Queen of England, even though it was unprecedented that a woman would rule a monarchy that early in the Middle Ages. So they, of course, all swore to it. And then as soon as he died, they brought his nephew Stephen over from France, and there was a civil war for like 20 years in England that was just bloody and completely unproductive, partly because of a limitation in primogeniture. So, it was a system that worked, but it had its flaws. The quote I always think of when I think of this is Winston Churchill was once asked about democracy, right? Because he lived in a world where fascism was a thing, communism was a thing, and he was saying, somebody had said to him, well, democracy is obviously the best system. And Churchill, with his characteristic wit, replied, democracy is the worst form of government, except for all those others that have been tried from time to time. And what he's saying is there's no form of government that works perfectly because we're dealing with people. And so that's always a gong show. But he said, of all the governments we know of all the forms of rule we know of, it's the best we got. So that's the one I'm going to stick with. And that's probably true of primogeniture as well. At the time, it was the best form of government available, which is why so many countries practiced it. The other form, which is the one that's at play in the play, pardon the pun, is Tanistry. Tanistry is a system, the name also comes from Latin, the word tanist, and it just means the chief holder of lands. So Tanistry worked with a slightly different method. It worked by a slightly different method. As I mentioned earlier, it was prominent in countries like Scotland and Ireland and other Celtic-based cultures. And the way it would work is that the monarch, who would always be a king, right, with certain exceptions that were extremely rare, but basically the king would normally choose his eldest son to succeed him. Unless there was some reason why that couldn't be. Like, for example, he didn't have a son, right? Then he could choose a nephew, or he could choose a brother, or he could choose any other male relative who was qualified for the position. And by qualified, they couldn't have any serious physical or mental flaws. But normally, he would choose his eldest son. What's interesting about Tanistry is that the pros and cons are actually reversed. So one of the pros in primogeniture is that it ensured a fairly smooth succession, or at least promoted a fairly smooth succession. In Tanistry, it's the opposite, because if he chose a relative that all the other relatives didn't particularly like, there could be a massive civil war. There could be bloody unrest. Because it was a subjective choice of the reigning king, people could disagree with it, and they could take up arms in order to prove their point. So that was a con of Tanistry that was a pro of primogeniture. The pro of primogeniture, or of Tanistry, pardon me, the benefit was what was a con in primogeniture. The benefit of Tanistry was it made it highly or much more likely that the person who inherited the throne would be qualified. So, the son with the gambling problems, or the son with the moral character flaws, or whatever, could be weeded out by the reigning king. He could pick somebody other than his son if the son didn't qualify, which was a bonus. In the case of Macbeth, right, the fact that this system was at play allowed the witches to make a prophecy and have it even make sense. Like, the prophecy would make no sense if the witches made it in England, because somebody who's not a member of the royal line could never be king. It didn't matter how it worked, right? But because Macbeth used Tanistry and Scotland used Tanistry, it was theoretically possible that Macbeth could be the king because he was a relative of Duncan's. So when they tell him he's going to be the king, he wouldn't have immediately thought, well, that's ridiculous. He would have thought, oh, that's possible. That could happen. And so the whole rest of the play hinges on that fact. And that's why he's surprised and kind of annoyed when Duncan seems to go against the prophecy and name Malcolm as his heir. Even though in England that would be a slam dunk, in Scotland a high likelihood, Macbeth could still hold out a reasonable hope that he might still be king. And of course, as we see, he's willing to help things along with the help of his crazy wife and his own ambition. So Tanistry survived as a system in Scotland until the reign of James I, who was James VI of Scotland, so early 17th century. James the first, who was James VI of Scotland, took the English throne in 1603. And one of the first things he did was abolish the system of Tanistry in Scotland, thereby ensuring that whoever sat on the English throne would also be the King of Scotland, right? So his son, Charles I, would automatically become the King of Scotland. He wouldn't have to pick anybody. There'd be no uprising. There'd be nothing. He basically merged the two systems together. At the time, they were separate countries with a lot of animosity between them, and so it was one of the ways in which he tried to kind of join the two countries together. He got rid of Tanistry. What's ironic about this is the very flaw of primogeniture took place when his own son took the throne. His own son, Charles I, was by most accounts a terrible English king. He was a tyrant. He loved fighting expensive wars. He was constantly taxing his people to finance these wars. He was hated by virtually every English person. It got so bad that Parliament basically convicted him of treason for the way he treated his own people, and they chopped his head off at Whitehall in 1648 or 49. I can't remember which year it was, but I remember standing on the street outside of Whitehall like 2 months ago, looking at the place where they chopped his head off and thinking, wow, this is very cool. Anyway, I digress. So James I abolished Tanistry, and of course James I would be the person watching Macbeth. It's interesting the way history and literature come together. As a final note, the issue of succession to the monarchy is a big issue in a lot of Shakespeare's plays. I'm going to mention 2 other ones, but there's way more. And I'm going to mention them because I teach both of them. So the idea of who gets to be king is important in Hamlet, because in the play, it starts out with the king having died. Now, normally in a primogeniture system, Hamlet Jr., the character whose the play is named after, he would become the king automatically. But because Hamlet's set in Denmark, that doesn't happen. And that's important because the play hinges on the fact that Hamlet's uncle Claudius marries his mother and thereby becomes the king. That's what sets up the whole conflict in the play. That conflict would have been impossible in a system that practiced primogeniture. So Shakespeare couldn't have set the play in England and had it make any sense. The second play that this works in is King Lear. Now, King Lear is set in England, but it's set in a prehistoric England, so thousands of years before recorded history, or at least hundreds of years before recorded history. And in Lear, Lear decides he's tired, he's old, he wants to retire, and so he divides up his kingdom while he's still alive amongst his 3 daughters and basically goes on holiday. That's the premise. What he's doing is essentially giving his kingdom to his sons-in-law, okay, who are married to his daughters. Again, not possible in primogeniture, but possible if that system is somehow pushed out of the way. So in Hamlet and Macbeth, he pushes it out of the way by setting the plays in different countries. In Lear, he pushes primogeniture out of the way by setting it in a different time period. But either way, the idea of who should and could and would sit on the English throne was a really important topic that Shakespeare dealt with in a lot of his plays. And the reason for that is because it was a really important topic in English culture, which we may or may not talk about. We definitely will talk about this in grade 12 and maybe in grade 11. But for now, that's all I have to say. So Macbeth can become king because of Tanistry. That's the reason. Hope that helped.